this is a problem that has plagued Russia for such a long time. I'm probably not so optimistic that even if the war has sped up the need for that to improve, I'm not so sure they've actually still going to be able to overcome it.
Our guest today is Emily Ferris, a Russia specialist at the defence think tank RUSI. Emily, welcome.
Good morning.
We're starting to hear from Finland's president, who played golf with the US president, and from Donald Trump himself, using pretty direct language, a level of frustration with the lack of progress on a ceasefire. What is the holdup?
I think this was probably a bit inevitable. I know there's been quite a bit of, perception that Russia's been quite gleeful about a Trump presidency, and that might suggest that things are finally looking up for Russia in terms of its position internationally. But the reality is, Trump's and America's national interests and Russia's national interests sometimes converge, and sometimes they really fundamentally diverge. And what you really see happening at the moment is the Russians are just trying to buy time with this ceasefire. I don't think they're particularly serious immediately about a ceasefire. There might be the view, I think, they're going to see what they can get, what concessions they can get from the Americans, from the Europeans and the Ukrainians as well. And I think they're evaluating, waiting for their options. And the way to do that really is just to mire everything in bureaucracy. And the lack of swiftness, I think, is what's frustrating Trump here at the moment.
Is there a feeling in Russia that they can get away with this buying time, with kicking the can down the road to delay or even avoid a deal?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's the main strategy, really. And I think that was pretty apparent from the beginning, because one of the things that the Russians do rather well is to mire things in bureaucracy. And that's why you hear Putin talking about the importance of these details, the importance of going back to the root causes of the war. I mean, that's really just taking us down a road that is very difficult to sort of see a way through. A ceasefire is all very well, but I think what the Russians are really interested in is seeing, first of all, how far they can push into Ukrainian territory, because obviously they've been doing rather better on the battlefield recently. They want to make sure that that any kind of ceasefire doesn't include bits of Russian territory. So obviously its southern border is still not quite fully under Russian control. And I think they want to just see how far really Trump might break with Europe. So some of the conversations that we've heard coming out of Moscow in the last few days about the conditions for a ceasefire and peace in the Black Sea region are all contingent on quite strange suggestions, like specific banks that they'd like sanctions eased on, and specific industries like fishing or agriculture, some of which actually haven't been particularly hard hit by the sanctions in particular, and can still kind of operate rather well without the sanctions. And some of it actually is not even under American jurisdiction. So trying to connect, for example, one of the banks that Russia's suggested sanctions be eased, connect it up to the SWIFT banking system. But that's a banking system that's frankly run in Brussels and headquartered there. So of course, Washington could do that, but it wouldn't make a difference. So I think what the Russians are doing is probing a little bit to try to see what the Americans will try to push the Europeans to do, if the Americans even have the power to do that. So for now, a lot of what you can see from the Russian side really is just waiting and watching.
And kind of tinkering around with these details. How will Putin and the Kremlin be considering the sort of threats that Donald Trump is making, particularly these secondary tariffs he's talking about?
Well, they probably should take those rather seriously. It seems that Trump has actually done that on other countries, and it's perfectly possible that he would do that to Russia as well. But what I think that really illustrates is how quickly that relationship can kind of turn on a dime. So if at the beginning we're saying, well, look, how well the Americans and the Russians are cozying up to each other, suddenly if you're dealing with such a volatile personality in Trump, that can change so quickly, which is why I can very easily foresee a situation in which Russian and American interests suddenly completely diverge, and then a ceasefire deal such that it is will be in tatters quite quickly.
If that happens, it all ends up in tatters. How would Russia's wartime economy be hit by the sort of measures that Donald Trump's talking about?
It probably depends. I mean, the Russians, I know that's a very sort of surface little answer. The reason I'm thinking about it is the Russians have reasonably well sort of moved around sanctions. It's not so much sort of sanctions evasion necessarily, but part of it is sort of obviously the substitution domestically with some of the products that they needed. Some of it is just finding another back door into Europe. But they have sort of been under some form of sanctions now for over 10 years, since 2014, really. So having additional sanctions could possibly, it depends which sector. There's very little left to sanction, frankly, from the Russian side. The sanctions actually that the Biden administration put on Russia as a sort of departing shot before he left office were one of the most serious, and they did have an impact on Russia because they were targeting oil and gas, which had been kind of left off the register for a while. Those have an impact. Where you see sanctions kind of biting in Russia at the moment, interestingly, is in the coal sector, where you see huge amounts of bankruptcies, difficulty exporting it, global demand for coal generally is down as well, so that probably doesn't help. Difficulty sort of moving it around, finding clients for it, disagreements with China about how you manage that. But Russia, as you probably know, Russia's tried pretty hard to reorientate all of that trade towards China and the Far East. So I'm not sure from a sort of trade perspective how much additional American sanctions might have an impact. But as we've seen really since this war, the Russian economy is rather more resilient and less sort of hollowed out than I suppose people expected.
We even see these reports that some of the poorest parts of Russia are experiencing an economic revival, even in the Far East, the sort of places Americans would call the Rust Belt. Would that kind of revival sustain if the Kremlin gets these things that it wants, opens back up to the US, gets a kind of great economic deal as part of the world trading system again? Does the Rust Belt keep growing in the same way as it has been under this wartime economy?
It's actually a really interesting question because the tension between Moscow and the Far East of Russia is huge. So really, for centuries, actually, Russia's been trying to connect up those regions a bit better. But you've got a really dense kind of railway network in the West that was all really orientated, as well as its pipeline infrastructure, towards Europe. Then you've got really quite sparse population, limits of geography, a lot of it's marshy or permafrost, a scattered population, not much railways, not much of anything really. And then to try to link up those two things and even to try to link the Far East within itself is actually a gargantuan task that the Russians haven't been able to do. Now, what the war did was kind of speed up the need for that to happen. So there has been a bit of an investment, like you say, in the Russian Far East, but to the extent to which it's borne fruit, I'm not so sure. And I think there's always been quite a sort of political tension between the regions of Moscow where they felt that all the resources are concentrated in the west of Russia and that any kind of suggestion that there's a boom going on in the Far East is sort of just like a political statement. These mega projects that kind of mean nothing, but huge amounts of money spent on a bridge to nowhere or whatever it is. And these things never really go anywhere or have kind of practical use. So the Far East is super important because it's kind of the gateway to China. So I'm sure the investment will go there. Whether that kind of actually means anything for locals, I'm not so sure. It's kind of not really delivered on some of the job prospects there. It's not really improved kind of access to education. They've tried numerous things to get people to move there. They've offered land, especially to veterans coming back from the war. They've said, if you resettle in the Far East, we'll give you this land for free. But the uptake, as far as I can tell, is not so high. And that's partly because it's not very fertile land. It's very difficult to farm, very difficult to settle. And there's a reason people haven't really lived there historically. So this is a problem that has plagued Russia for such a long time. I'm probably not so optimistic that even if the war has sped up the need for that to improve, I'm not so sure they've actually still going to be able to overcome it.
Back here in Europe, leaders are calling out the stalling tactics that are going on in Russia. Dmitry Peskov, the Kremlin spokesman, says, we're still talking with Washington. We might have another call between Trump and Putin. Is this all just part of their plan?
Well, of course, they want to keep the lines of communication open. There's lots of very good reasons to talk to America, not least, from a sort of prestige perspective from the Russians. They've always kind of sought, I think, the attention and acknowledgement of the Americans that they are indeed a great power that's worthy of coming to the table. So the link in and of itself is important. Then there are things they actually do have to talk to the Americans about. They have areas of commonality. So you can see there's links going on between the two intelligence agencies, which had sort of died down since the war. I don't believe they fully stopped, but but certainly this is at least public knowledge now that they are talking. And it seems that what the Russians really want is to be seen as an equal that's perhaps willing to be, even part of a security architecture in future. Russia has always been quite sort of derisive of the G8 as it was, and now the G7, and have been sort of removed from that. But really, I think what the Russians would probably want most of all is a seat at the table when it comes to sort of major political decisions, and things like forums like the UN. Russia sees as just completely running counter to Russia's own interests, and a place where it just tries to further its own national interests, but other countries are against them. So I think what the Russians are keen on doing is trying to build a security architecture around itself, where they can sort of project their own opinions.
Do you think Vladimir Putin would think that seat at the table, that great power, status, the spheres of influence idea, that it's worth it to give a peace deal on the basis of getting that in return?
I think there are some concessions that Putin's probably more willing to make than it seems. So, we can talk about how to carve up bits of Ukrainian territory, unsavory though it is. I think there are parts of that territory that probably Putin would be willing to cede. He's giving these maximalist demands at the moment, similar to the way that Trump is operating, but I think they're probably willing to walk back a little bit from some of that. It matters kind of less now, to be honest. What they're most interested in is a sort of defanged Ukraine that doesn't have any kind of sort of military potential, that leaves a backdoor open for Russia to influence its political scene. So that's why you see Russia calling for elections. Particularly important because Putin has made a great big deal about how he sees Zelensky, and I won't repeat the language that he uses to talk about him, but he's been quite clear that he won't deal with him as a leader, and that is probably one of the most important things to Putin at the moment, to try to push elections. The Americans have been a little bit circumspect about it. I'm not sure the extent to which they really feel they can pressure the Ukrainians into holding elections, but it will happen eventually, and for Putin that will be a big win. That maybe not the administration immediately after Zelensky, but perhaps the one after that, might sort of yield a president or some sort of leader that is in some way not pro-Russian, because the sentiment of Ukraine at the moment I can't see changing anytime soon, but maybe not against a relationship with Russia. And I can very much foresee that happening in the next sort of 5-10 years. And I think Russia's really thinking long term when it comes to Ukraine, and they won't sort of let this lie. They've made clear that they see Ukraine and Belarus, frankly, as not even spheres of influence, like you were saying. It's beyond that. They see it as an integral part of Russian territory. That doesn't mean, by the way, that they have those same designs on other countries. But certainly Belarus and Ukraine are very specifically in that sort of Moscow mentality, an inextricable part of Russia.
Emily Ferris of RUSI, thank you very much for your time today.